excited to be here with my new friend, Dr. Clint Arnold, and we're excited to be talking about a brand new piece of scholarship from the renowned Word Biblical Commentary series. Word Biblical Commentary goes back a long ways, but it's now in sort of replacement volumes or supplemental volumes kind of iteration under the capable hands of David Capes through Zondervan. And so we're going to be talking today about that. Clint, can I call you Clint?
Please.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so excited to have you on, and thank you for being here.
It's a privilege to be here, Nijay. Thank you.
Let's go back. Before we get into this big book, let's go back because I know you as the magic guy, the magic and folk religion guy. And you've done some commentaries. I see you've done work on Ephesians, you've done work on Acts. But your work has been kind of in the sort of nitty-gritty of understanding the religious landscape of the Roman world, the first century, the time of the apostles, Jesus and the apostles. Tell us, how did you get interested in magic and folk religion, and why is this relevant to the study of the context of the New Testament?
Yeah, great question. People have asked me that a number of times and wonder how I got into that side of things. I went to the University of Aberdeen in 1983 with the intent of trying to see if I could find a topic related to the theme of power in Paul's letters that would be academically justifiable. Behind that was just, I was still a relatively new Christian, became a Christian as a teenager, and wanted to better understand what the Scripture had to say about accessing the power of God to grow in the Christian faith. And so my supervisor at Aberdeen, a man named Howard Marshall,
legend,
he said, I think that sounds like a worthwhile topic to pursue. And then after a period of study there, we both recognized that there's an unusual concentration of power terminology in Ephesians and in Colossians. And he suggested to me, why don't you focus on those two letters and rigorously put to those two letters the question why? Why is there such an emphasis?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't take too long to recognize that there's an opposing sphere of power that is looming in the background of both those letters. Paul speaks frequently of principalities, powers, authorities, world rulers, thrones, dominions. I mean, he lets the stops out in terms of the vocabulary that he uses, such a wide-ranging vocabulary.
Yeah.
And what was prompting all of this, and of course, everyone knows in Ephesians there's an elongated discussion on spiritual warfare, armor of God.
Yeah.
Why there, and why wasn't that in Romans or 2 Corinthians or something of that nature? That thrusts me into the book of Acts, and we look at the book of Acts, and Luke narrates just three different big accounts of things that went on in Ephesus while Paul was planting the church there. And one of those was a failed exorcism in which a guy named Sceva and his 7 sons have to flee. And then it says a great fear came over the whole region because of this, the renown of this situation. And as a result of that, people became convicted of their magical practices and brought them out, and they had a big bonfire that day. Well, so what was all this? What were these magical practices? And I think we are living in a time when we've been well served by archaeology, in the sense that not only have archaeologists dug up numerous New Testament papyri in the sands of Egypt, they've also found hundreds of magical texts that give us a window into seeing what were these people practicing in places like Ephesus in the first century. And it certainly involved trafficking in various kinds of spirits and this sort of thing. Well, Luke tells us in Acts 19 that it wasn't the general population that had this conviction that fell over them that caused them to bring out their texts and burn them. He said it was those who had believed that brought their texts out and burned them. In other words, Christians.
Yeah, wow.
And so that made me realize that there is an incredibly strong impulse to hold on to the traditions that we grew up with, the traditions that we've received. And in spite of the fact that there was great discipleship happening in Ephesus with the Apostle Paul, they were still secretly holding on to these kinds of practices, and it took the sovereign intervention of God to bring conviction on them. So anyway, these people who practiced magic, at least for Ephesus in that region, are the nucleus of the church. And it's these kinds of practices give us an insight into what common people, how they lived and how they dealt with issues, how they would deal with sickness and seek health and a recovery from sickness and that sort of thing, and deliverance and this kind of thing. And this similar kind of thing was happening in Colossae, actually through the whole Mediterranean world. It's just we get a lot of information about these two sites. So I hope that was short enough.
That's great. No, that's great. I've only kind of dabbled in this area in the last 5 to 10 years with my book Strange Religion, where I'm looking at the religious landscape of the Roman world. And man, I came to realize how unfortunately this area is ignored by most biblical scholarship, most New Testament scholarship. Why do you think that is? Is it just unfamiliarity?
There's definitely some unfamiliarity, and it's really in the last 100 years that we've gained a lot of understanding in this realm because of the discovery of magical papyri. But there's been numerous other kinds of artifacts that show us what this is all about. I mean, thousands of amulets that people would wear, curse tablets, all sorts of things like that. But even so, in the last 100 years, there hasn't been many scholars looking at this kind of material to give us insight into common belief, folk practice, and so on. Some of that may be a bias with a naturalistic worldview that inclines us to want to look at other things, other factors, and other stuff. But it's a good question, and I don't know if I can fully fathom the depths of the response that would need to be given for that.
Yeah. In my work with Strange Religion, I came across lots of fascinating things, but for example, the Cornelian law of assassiners and poisoners, which outlaws magic with severe penalty, including crucifixion, among many other things, just to show what kind of threat this posed to the Roman order, to have people wielding unimaginable power, potentially unstoppable power. And so they even had to outlaw it and that sort of thing. That gives some sort of texture to that. All right, let's pivot over to Colossians and get into the commentary a bit. Give us a little bit of background. I mean, signing up to write a commentary like this, I remember John Barclay, I think he turned down one of the big commentaries, maybe ICC Galatians, because he said, I didn't want that hanging over my head for 20 years. And I don't, tell us, how did you come to be an author of this? Why were you interested in doing it? This is going to be, I'm sure, just a major part of your life and research for many, many, many years. Give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, well, 20 years seems to be the magical number because that's when I signed my contract.
Yeah.
It was in 2004 when Ralph Martin was the editor. And now, 21 years later, it finally comes out. But I had a 10-year hiatus as a dean, and that really slowed things down quite a bit. So Colossians was part of my doctoral research. When I published my dissertation, Cambridge University Press asked me to reduce my manuscript by 40%. And that was like... a stab in the heart, because how do you get rid of 40% of what you've sweat over for so many years? So I eliminated everything on Colossians and then tightened everything else up, and that was satisfactory to the press at the time. But I also had this feeling that there was a lot more to be discovered from
Sure.
historical research, papyri, inscriptions, and all these sorts of things. So in 1991, I received a grant from the Lilly Foundation and spent a year in Tübingen, Germany, researching Colossians
Hmm.
and spending time with some scholars that I had deep respect for. One of them was even paid by my grant to be a mentor during that time, Peter Stolmacher,
Yeah.
who just recently passed away.
Mm.
Martin Hengel, another one. So I ended up continuing to work on Colossians then, and what turned out to be a part of a dissertation back previously turned into a 400-page book that was titled The Colossian Syncretism.
Mm.
And it was a few years after that Ralph Martin contacted me and asked me if I'd be willing to explore the possibility of doing the Word series, the commentary in the Word series. There had been a previous commentary on Colossians in the Word series published by
Right.
Peter O'Brien.
Right.
Ralph had asked Peter to revise it, and at the time Peter had been stricken by cancer, and that did not come up to the top of the priority list for him. So
Of
Peter
course.
gave me his blessing. Ralph asked me to do this, and I signed on, and I had no idea it would take me over 20 years to do it.
Well, we're going to come back to some of the common challenging issues of Colossians, but since you've already talked about your interest in magic and folk religion, can you just tell us a couple of places in Colossians where having some knowledge of the religious context helps us better interpret certain verses or texts in Colossians? Give us a couple easy examples that come to mind.
Yeah, I don't know if any of them are downright easy, but what I would say is where Colossians lends itself to this kind of research is the fact that there's a really strange factional teaching that is emerging in that church. And Paul sees it as a threat to the health and stability of the church, and so he's speaking out against it. One of the places where we can see how this kind of material and this background could help is in a controversial passage where in Colossians 2:18, Paul makes reference to the fact that the so-called opponents are engaging in the worship of angels.
Yeah.
And it's like, what is that all about? Are they groups of people going off on Sunday evening with their guitars? Hey, let's meet in my home and we'll get the guitars out and worship angels? Or was there something different? It's a different word for worship that's used there that has ritualistic connotations to it. And as I got into the inscriptional data for Western Asia Minor, it's surprising how many inscriptions there are that mention angels all throughout Western Asia Minor. But the one commonality that they have among them is that they are invocations or calling on angels for help, for protection, for deliverance from evil of various sorts. And we're continuing to find these. They found an inscription recently just north of Colossae in the city of Hierapolis, a tomb, a lead lamella amulet that was rolled up and placed in a tomb. And it basically called on angels, Michael, Gabriel, and then it lists a whole bunch of weird things, Abrasax, which is a pagan solar deity, and other deities, to come and help and avert this person from any kind of injury. And that form is just exceedingly common. And so does this then give us some kind of insight into what Paul might be talking about when he says rituals involving angels?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating, and that helps solve the question: is it angels worshiping, or are they worshiping angels? And you would say this points to the worship of angels, worshiping angels rather than the angels worshiping something else. One of the things, okay, so let's talk about this. 800 pages, 250-page introduction. I mean, I've written commentaries that are less than 250 pages. So, a 250-page introduction. So, people go about introductions differently. Steve Walton, in his Acts commentary, has a shorter introduction and then does more in the second volume, which is yet to come out. Yours, you front load a lot of the information. I like that because I like to know up front. I like to have some of those pieces in place. But you talk pretty transparently about certain things that are really challenging that you have to wrestle with and that scholarship has to wrestle with. One of them is authorship. And you say a few times in this commentary, you had to cross that bridge when you wrote on Colossians earlier in your career. And now that you had to cross it again for this commentary, you're convinced now more than ever that we should view Paul as the author. Can you just give us a short version of what makes you so convinced that this is not what scholars refer to as pseudonymous or written by someone else in Paul's name?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that's a big issue in the academic realm. A big part of the introduction is the authorship question.
I
because
could tell,
70 or 80 pages, and I felt like for a commentary series of this nature that is engaging the world of scholarship, that it was essential to take this on in a deeper way. So there's a constellation of issues that need to be sorted through that together combine toward reaching a conclusion. And so some will point to it's the vocabulary, it's the style of the letter that doesn't look Pauline, it's the theology of the letter that doesn't look like it's from Paul, it's some of the historical matters that don't look like they're from Paul. And so I grapple with all of those. I think the thing that was exceedingly helpful for me is there was a German monograph that was written many years ago that scholars throughout the continent, the UK, and many even here in the United States pointed to as the nail in the coffin for Pauline authorship. It was an academic monograph written by a man named Walter Bujard, and it was a style analytical analysis of Colossians, using a lot of statistics and data from just word computations and everything. And I thought, I really need to grapple with this. I hadn't seen anyone take it on seriously. And I still think that there's probably more of a need to explore his work in depth. But as I got into it and looked at it and then did some of my own stylistic and vocabulary and grammatical analyses of the letter, I realized that, in my view, Bujard had been very selective in his use of evidence. He had failed to establish criteria for when a certain statistical preponderance was sufficient to judge the authorship question and say and reach a conclusion like, well, Paul could not have said it that way. Right. It lacked that kind of methodological rigor and so on. I did some comparative work with other letters of the same size, such as 1 Thessalonians and Philippians, and then a couple of other letters outside the New Testament, doing the same statistical analysis that he did, and found that there was just great variation among all of them.
Yes.
Which to me not only blunted the force of his argument, but really undermined it significantly. And yet this was a work that so many have touted as, that just is decisive for determining that Paul could not have written Colossians.
Yeah, I've done some work on this, and there are a lot of factors, and people try to do a cumulative approach, vocabulary, style of writing, all that stuff. You talk to some degree about like a letter secretary, perhaps co-writers, that sort of thing. I found that the only silver bullet that could take down Pauline authorship is what I call historical implausibility. That there are things said in there that just absolutely could not come from that time period. And Tom Wright, I think in his big Paul and the Faithfulness of God book, said it's high time we clear the chessboard and start again. And I think he means we didn't do a good job at the beginning when we started all this conversation in the 1800s, and we're working with sort of old logic that doesn't keep up with just what you're saying. When you're even before you mentioned some of the comparisons with other letters, I thought about Harold Honer's trick, where he applies the techniques that scholars use to deem Ephesians pseudonymous, and he applies that to Galatians, and he says by the same criteria, Galatians would also fail the test of Pauline authorship. I don't know if you read that, but it's a fantastic.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. I've spent some time working on 2 Corinthians right now. I'm translating through 2 Corinthians, and it is such a strange letter. And it is so unlike the other letters, even unlike 1 Corinthians. And then I worked through Philemon recently, and again, Philemon is so unlike the other letters in so many ways. And so I do. One of my biggest concerns is that SBL, Society Biblical Literature, separates the study of Pauline literature from the disputed letters. I think that's a huge mistake. Scholars like Frank Matera, Luke Timothy Johnson, Tom Wright are all calling for a revision of all this. So I thank you for your contribution to that. I wholeheartedly agree. Let's talk a little bit about the false teaching, maybe really briefly. Scholarship have gone in waves, and there was kind of a sort of Greek, kind of maybe a Gnostic wave, and then with Jimmy Dunn and Tom Wright and others, there was a huge Jewish, within Judaism kind of wave. You provided, a different perspective as well. Where did you land in this commentary? I know you've contributed this in the past, but in this commentary, I did skim it, but 250 pages. So where do you land in this work on how you describe the Colossian false teaching or philosophy?
Yes, I see it as both Jewish and Hellenistic and Roman. I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too.
Yeah,
but
okay.
I feel like I can do that in the realm of folk belief and what we referred to earlier as magic, because for those that are interested in that and pursue it, it's not orthodoxy that matters, it's power. What works? If my daughter has a 104-degree temperature, what do I do about that? Is Jesus going to make any difference at all? And traditionally, people in a society like that was much more animistic and open to the spiritual realm than those in the West have been, would go to somebody that has an esoteric knowledge, that has wisdom in dealing with matters of this nature, because it might have been as a result of an evil eye. It might have been as a result of a curse. It may have been from a variety of other spirit-induced reasons. So they go and they consult a magos or a magician or a witch doctor, a healing doctor, or, as modern anthropologists would call it, a shaman figure. And they would pay him some money, and he would give them some kind of spiritual remedy, maybe including performing a ritual, wearing an amulet, invoking certain spirits and gods and goddesses to deal with the issues. So my thought in my conclusion with regard to Colossians and the problem there is that it was this kind of a figure that is looming in the background of Colossians, somebody that we might be able to describe as shamanistic in their approach. And so because power is what is important to this person, they can call on Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael at the same time that they call on Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, or Hermes, or any of a number of other gods, Ebrisox, the the solar deity. And we find this kind of phenomenon all the time. And so there's this meshing, this blending, syncretism, we would call it, that is taking place in this area of folk belief. So I don't see it as something that's more highfalutin, philosophical, like Gnosticism or some kind of Middle Platonic thought or even Jewish mysticism or something, but I see it as something very grassroots oriented that's related to this kind of day-to-day life phenomenon.
Yeah, that's helpful. Let's talk about a couple of parts of Colossians that I'm always fascinated by. One is the Christ hymn in Colossians chapter 1. You know, a few years ago, John Dixon and I, you know John Dixon?
Yeah, he's been on our campus recently.
Oh, yeah, he's great. And he and I are buddies, but we got into an argument on, not an argument, a loving friendship argument on social media about whether and to what degree it's helpful to look for preformed traditions in Paul. And I was on the team that said, let's not go on a hunt for these traditions because all we have are the texts that we have. And he was kind of like, wouldn't it be fascinating to know what primitive Christianity was like? Wouldn't it be fascinating to know the traditions behind the traditions? So we went back and forth for days, maybe even weeks, on this one thread. And I didn't actually hunt down and look at what you did, but where do you land on this question of kind of digging beneath Philippians 2 or Colossians 1 or 1 Timothy to look for preformed traditions in Paul and other parts of the New Testament?
Yeah, I do reach a conclusion, but I will admit that it's not something that I would stake my life on here because we're in a significant realm of speculation here.
That's right.
But Colossians 3:16 to me points to the fact that there were these kinds of things floating around. So Colossians 3:16, you remember, says, "Let the word about Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another with songs and hymns and spiritual songs." So we know that the early church at this stage was worshiping, and that there were lyrics written that taught the people about Jesus Christ. Now it's just fascinating that Colossians 1:15 to 20, at the minimum, is very poetic, but possibly also hymnic, in the sense that it reflects lyrics that would have been sung in the liturgy of the early church. The formal characteristics of Colossians 1:15 to 20 point to something going on here like that. And so I lean in that direction, but again, for me, it's more of a 60-40. I could see Paul writing this himself. He was certainly capable of writing in a very elevated poetic style, but I like the idea of the fact that it might be something that the Colossian believers already knew, they were singing, and yet Paul could cite it and tell them, hey, your lives are a bit out of sync with what you're singing and extolling about Christ every week. There's a lot of detail we could get into on that, but that, in general terms, that's where I land.
Yeah. And that's true of Philippians and 1 Timothy as well. They're used as reminders and correctives. Let's jump towards the end of Colossians. And whenever I teach on Colossians, or even when I was writing on Colossians, you always kind of, with fear and trembling, have to address the household code, 3:18 to 4:1. And just for those who are watching or listening, there's an old debate called the Balch-Elliott debate, and so David Balch argued that the household codes are about accommodationism and Christians fitting in and having a positive witness through accommodating to culture, Roman culture. And John Elliott comes in with a very different argument, saying what we should notice is not how much the household codes come from Aristotle or Greco-Roman political philosophy, but the Christian distinctiveness of the household code. How did you navigate talking about the household code in light of its origins in Aristotle, and in light of this Balch-Elliott debate, which I know is for 1 Peter, but applies to other household code texts as well.
Yeah, once again, this is a huge debate, a lot of different aspects to this issue. One thing is I look at the texts in Aristotle and Stoicism and Aristodemus and a variety of others. What I don't find in there is a set literary form or Gattung.
That's right. Yeah.
But rather a literary motif where various members of the household are addressed. I also would observe that in all of the Hellenistic codes, the one looming in the background is the paterfamilias, the head of the household. And so all the instructions are given toward the head of the household on how order should be provided in the household. Now, when we turn to the household code in Colossians, which is the very first household code we have in the New Testament, what we find, in my view, is something that is very different than what we have in Hellenistic or Roman texts, because each of the individual members of the household are addressed specifically and individually. A basis is given with a causal clause or something of that nature for a reason for why they should live in a certain way. And I think much of what is said in the Colossian household code undermines the role of the paterfamilias, so that it becomes quite countercultural in what it's saying, so that it's not then an accommodation to culture, but rather a countercultural piece. But even so, I don't think that's the intent so much as recognizing that I think it's 7 times that Jesus as Lord is mentioned in just the span of a few short verses. Right. What does it mean to live in a Christian household? What does it mean for Christian members to live under the lordship of Christ in this new reality? Now, the final thing that I would mention here, and all of this you can go 10 miles deep, is there has been since these guys debated it, the ones you mentioned, there's been a magnificent discovery at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls called 4Q instruction. And 4Q instruction gives instructions to various members of the household. And we would put this in the category of wisdom. And wisdom is a major theme in Colossians. And Christ is presented as the wisdom of God in Colossians, even in 1:15-20. And so what I think is going on in the household code is a uniquely Christian sort of thing, representing what it looks like for Christian members of the household to live in light of reflection on Genesis 1 and 2, in light of the Jewish wisdom tradition. And there was a scholar years ago, Andrew Lincoln, that did a wonderful piece rooting it in the Jewish wisdom tradition, and I think he was essentially right in that, so that it's not really a Hellenistic thing, in spite of the fact that it's a shared motif, but it's much more Jewish in orientation, and not an accommodation to culture.
I think one of the shocks, perhaps, and disappointments of modern readers of the Bible is what appears to be Paul's condoning of slavery. And this became a huge issue throughout time, but especially in the 1800s in the United States, where theologians and politicians had to answer back to those people that were using texts like Colossians and Philemon to justify slavery. What do you think Paul actually thought about slavery? Because you'll hear people say, and I think they're wrong, that Roman slavery wasn't so bad. It depends on
it's slavery. You're owned. You don't have freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this idea of good slavery, I don't think that holds up for most people when they think about it. And so this raises a lot of questions about, what I often hear from students is, why didn't Paul just call for all Christians to free their slaves, that sort of thing? How do you explain that as you look at Colossians, as you look at similar texts that are talking about encouraging slaves to be obedient, good slaves?
Yeah, I think Paul prioritized the gospel, and so communicating the gospel, planting churches, socializing new believers in new communities was first and foremost on his mind. Nowhere in his writings do we see him challenging the established Roman order directly, explicitly.
Right.
So that's one observation here. But I think the teaching of Colossians is more radical than what some people have even realized, because he tells, in Colossians 4:1, he tells the slave owners to treat your slaves with justice and with equality. Isates is the Greek word. Now, most English versions translate isates as fairness.
Right.
The word is most commonly used for equality. Treat them
on the
with
same
equality.
level. Yeah.
Exactly on the same level.
Yeah.
There's been an important study done recently by a young scholar named Murray Vassar, who wrote a piece for Tyndale Bulletin on this particular question and made a very significant and strong case. We need to take the language seriously. It needs to be understood as equality. And this just completely upends slave-master relationships within the community of believers, so that there's transformation taking place within this community. But Paul doesn't take it that next step and say, okay, so let's organize, march on Rome, and tell Nero just where he can get off on this.
Right.
I just can't imagine him doing that. But if this is truly equality that he's arguing for, that's just revolutionary. One thing that was interesting in the research that Vassar has done is that there's been a new set of homilies of Origen that have been discovered in a library somewhere in Europe. And among those is a homily on, I believe it's Psalm 67, where Origen reflects on Colossians 4:1 and says basically the same thing that we're talking about here. He interprets that text to mean equality, not just fairness, and sees it as revolutionary. So if this is true, once again, we're in a situation here where this household code is really very countercultural.
I mean, you could draw a very easy connection to Philemon, where he says, welcome him as you'd welcome me. And here Paul is, a Roman citizen.
Yeah.
A free person. He's in jail, but he's a free person. Okay, I'm going to throw you a little bit of curveball, so if you want to skip it, you can. Given what you just said...
Uh-oh, you made me nervous now.
I know, it is a trick question, but you can not answer if you want. If a wealthy Christian gave to Paul a slave, would Paul take that slave?
If a wealthy Christian gave Paul a slave, would he take that slave? Or
would he feel a moral obligation not to take that slave? Let's put it that way.
Well, I don't have the advantage of having thought this through very carefully.
That's I told you, it's a curveball.
But Paul did receive a slave and used the slave for his service while he's in prison in Rome. And I mean, that was Onesimus. And that's where he ships him back and says, hey, I want to effect a reconciliation here, and I want you to receive him as much more than a slave or beloved brother. So I could see Paul accepting something like this, but the way then he would treat this person, the way he would treat them with equality and justice and everything else, it would look like everybody else, the way he's treating.
Yeah. Okay. You passed. I accept that. It's a challenging question. All right, we're on lightning round here, so maybe short answers because we got to wrap up. We could go on and on and on. It's already been more than 35 minutes. So writing a commentary changes. You have written a few commentaries. You've written a few commentaries. What do you know now after research and writing this commentary that you didn't know before, or that you know a lot better? Could be academic, could be spiritual, but how has this really changed, transformed your understanding of God or of Colossians or of something?
Yeah, for one thing, I've changed my mind on a number of a number of the exegetical issues in Colossians that I'd gone into print having a different opinion before. So it literally has changed my mind on a variety of things, getting more deeply.
Yeah, that's a good sign.
Maybe the way that this has transformed me the most is I am much more ready to pray, not just for people, but with people. Recognizing what Paul says in Colossians 2, 9, and 10, in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and you have been filled in him who is the head over every rule and authority. That is really the foundation for being able to pray for healing, pray for deliverance, pray for God's blessing on people because of that incredibly dynamic relationship with Christ who fills us.
That's wonderful. Thanks. What I love asking commentary writers, because I know this experience, is what exegetical problems still keep you up at night? And so you write this 800-page commentary, and people think you have all the answers, and kind of as you've sort of hinted at, sometimes you end up with you have to make a choice. But there's some easy ones and then some tougher ones. Which exegetical cruxes, issues do you feel like, gosh, I had to say something, I researched it, I gave it my best shot, but there's certain texts or certain conundrums that still sort of haunt you?
Yeah, one of the areas where I changed my mind, well, there's a couple of different areas. One of them was Colossians 1:29, filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions.
Oh, yes.
So I took an eschatological view initially, filling up the bowls, and that would trigger Christ's coming. And now I have changed my view on that, and I see it as Paul reflecting the fourth servant song and fulfilling the role of the servant of Yahweh in taking the gospel to the Gentiles as a servant. And so he is continuing the suffering of Christ because he's now in the body of Christ, and that body is continuing to suffer for his name. And that's the sense in which it's filling up what is lacking. The eschatological view had been really predominant for many years. A few have switched away from that, but that's a tough one. I mean, it certainly does not mean that we're adding to the atonement in some way, so we can run that one off the board. Yeah.
All right, last question's an easy one. You're a busy guy. You finished this project, but I'm sure the editing process and the post-production took months, if not years. So what are you working on now?
It's been nice to breathe.
Yes, breathe.
So I've been working on a variety of small projects right now. Ultimately, I will be diving into Philemon because I had appealed to Zondervan to split Philemon from this volume. They agreed to that. I will be co-writing Philemon with an African scholar named Daniel Darko.
Yeah, I know Danny.
And so we will be working on that together. I want to spend some time together with Daniel talking about reception history of Philemon, how it was used pro-slavery, how it was used against slavery. That interpretational history is very checkered. Yeah.
A lot of people working on Philemon at the moment. I'm working on it. Dennis Edwards, Lynn Kohik.
Okay.
So Dave Briones, Esau McCauley. So a lot of exciting things going on. Well, Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
The one other thing I would mention, since we're talking about Colossians and wrapping up here with Colossians, is the fact that the Turkish government, as of December of this last year, has granted permission for the site of Colossae to be excavated.
Yes, I saw that.
And
That's
so
exciting.
I've got to know the chief archaeologist, Boris Yaner, quite well, and have been working with him on kind of being a bit of a liaison here in the United States for raising money for the fund that they have and keeping people informed on that. So it's an incredibly exciting prospect. It'd be fun to see what they dig up there. I wish I could take my shovel and just head over there right now. It would be really cool.
I'll send some students. You could do that. Well, thank you so much, Clint, for your time. Again, check out Dr. Clinton Arnold's Word Biblical Commentary, Volume 44A, Colossians 2nd edition. And we'll look forward to more of your scholarship in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.